1857, the prayer meetings were filling 3 large churches each day at noon, and by March of 1858, every available public hall and church in New York City was filled every day during the noon hour for people praying. And Horace Greeley was a famous newspaper editor at the time. He sent a reporter just trying to attempt to count the numbers of people that were at these meetings. He could only get to 6 locations by horse and buggy in that time, in that 1 hour period, and still he counted 6,100 people on their knees praying to God, asking God to be moving. That prayer movement spread across the nation. As a result of that, at one season of this movement, 10,000 people were becoming believers of Jesus Christ each week. More than one scholar has estimated that probably 1 million people became followers of Jesus through these prayer meetings. A movement had begun. And so today, I'm praying a movement of God will show up in our lives. I'm asking you to join me as we consider a big thing and how we can make a difference for the Lord in this world. You know, to make a difference, we got to tell ourselves that I will be an instrument of revival in the church. You know, this is not a revival service, but I want to talk to you about being an instrument of revival in the church. I'm concerned about the church today, and I think many of you are. As a whole, we think about it, not just the local body, but the church as a whole. I bet I'm not alone when I say that my concern over the state of the modern church is not a one that I should take lightly. It's not something that I can always just brush off and say, oh, well, things always turn around. They always have. They always will. I have an article to share with the leaders of the church that I was asked to get together for them. It says 59% of millennials, those who are 20 to 30 years old, are leaving the church. And if we don't watch out, that means we have potentially 60% of an entire generation of people who could be heading to hell. Now, that ought to really shake the core of who you are. It does me when I read those type of statistics. Almost 60% of an entire generation could completely walk away from God, and that's a sobering thought for each one of us. Many of our churches around the world are beginning to look more like the Joe Story Senior Center on any given Sunday than the vibrant, life-giving church that Jesus intended us to be. So what's happened? Why? I think because many of us have failed to see our role in reviving the church. I mean, how can I be an instrument of revival in my local church? Now, let me just share with you as lovingly as I possibly can. Tom Rainer would say these words. He said, it's not about the institutional church. The problem is not the denominations, that we like to blame those. The problem is me, and it's you. Huh? Now, go back in the Old Testament in Isaiah chapter 6, and we find that the nation of Israel is going through a perilous time. We're wondering what's happening with the people. And as a result of that, we find in Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, it says, in the year of King Uzziah that he died, it says, I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphs, and with each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. Now at the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Isaiah says these words, woe to me, I cried, I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphs flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. And with it he touched my mouth and said, see, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for. And then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, here I am, send me. Now, when I accepted the call to my first full-time ministry, I'm like so many other young ministers who go to Bible college and study for ministry, and you finally give in that I'm going to be a minister, and you get excited about that. You want to just You know, Jimmy's been mentioning in some meetings about we may be raising up the next Billy Graham in our midst. Maybe God's setting the church up to get up with the next Billy Graham or the next Bob Russell or whoever it is that would just bring about the next great awakening. Maybe we've got the next Jeremiah Lanphier that is coming in our midst or maybe with us now, and God's trying to do something. And what is he going to do? He's going to use those around them to nurture them and to grow them and help them. And so I come out of the Bible college, and I'm going into ministry, and I take a congregation, and so many others during the time, they had an annual revival that was held every spring. And since we had gotten there late May, early June, my task for the following year was to round up a speaker for the following spring's revival. So I began to pray months ahead of time that God was going to do something big in that small church, and it had struggled for several years leading up to that point. And I asked Brother Dennis Crehan from the Jarvisburg Church of Christ. I said, Dennis, you always told us when we were in Bible college that if we ever needed anything, he was one of the advisors for our preaching ministry, that call on you. You'd be there for us. Well, I need somebody. I only know so many ministers. And I need a revival speaker. And he said, I'll be there. When's the date? And so we began to plan and we began to pray. Well, the congregation to share with me that the revival attendance has steadily declined over the past several years. And they felt like 50 or 60 people was going to be a good night's attendance. And typically when people say, how many did you have in church today? You'll say, oh, probably about 150, 170. You know, we got a range, you know. We stretch our range. So I'm not expecting a whole lot. And so I shared with Dennis not to expect large numbers each night, but they wanted to have the revival. And he, being always God's willing instrument, simply said this word. I can remember him and hear him almost saying it to me today. Dan, you pray, and I'll pray, and I'll be there, and we'll leave the rest up to God. I'm like, well, amen. That sounds good to me. So the first night, they were right on the number. It was Sunday night, started 60 people. We counted. We love numbers in the church. We counted. There were 60 of them. But God used those 60, the people that were going to be there, as instruments for what that revival was going to become. I never would have thought I was going to see what I saw that week. And each night the services grew, and by the third night there were few seats. People were, as a matter of fact, coming early, about 30, 45 minutes early, so they were coming in and getting a seat because they were worried they wouldn't have somewhere to sit when they got there. Now, obviously, there's those people who are always traditionalists. They sit in the same spot. We're creatures of habit. They wanted to make sure that somebody else didn't come in and take their seat. But there were others who were hearing about it. They had came in and had been invited. They were like, I'm coming back. I want to hear more about what's going on. Now, I'll tell you more about what was happening. As each night the services grew, Dennis was being used by God and that revival to bring about some painful truths in the lives of the members of our church. And all the other people who were coming were they were spectators to what God was doing. But hearts were breaking and renewal was taking place in each one. And I have to admit, I was a little afraid. I mean, God was using the revival to point out where individuals in the sins they had in their life were hindering the kingdom. And Dennis would preach on a certain sin, and then that may be going on in somebody's life, which then, as a result, affects the life of the church. And not only would he preach on something that would maybe be a hindrance to the growth of the church and what could stop revival, but then he would be walking down the aisle, and then he would just say, and look, here's the thing about it. They had asked me, said, now the preacher you're getting, he's not one of them people who's going to walk down the aisle and stuff, is he? You know, we like the preacher. I said, no, I've never seen him do that. And I had never seen Dennis do this many times. And he'd walk down the aisle, and he would go, God will not tolerate this blatant sin going on in his church and hindering the work, and I don't care if it's you. And I'm like, whoa. You know why? Because it was him. And I'm like, oh boy, I better start looking for another church. And as a result of that, as I looked around and I said, they probably think that I'm telling him them things. But I hadn't said a word. As a matter of fact, all I had asked him to do was just preach whatever God had laid on his heart. Whatever God lays on your heart, that's what I want you to share with us, because I really don't know the people good enough. I know we're struggling in certain areas, but I can't tell you exactly what's happening with all these people. And I was thinking maybe they were going to be glad to see him leave, as a matter of fact. But nothing was further from the truth. As a matter of fact, some of those same people were asking if we could extend our revival for another week and keep him on. It was pushing Easter that year. Dennis had already made commitments and obligations for a big celebration they were having at Jarvisburg. And he says, I just can't. I would love to. If we'd planned a different time, I might could have worked it out. But I've got this big celebration thing we're going on for Easter. By the way, he'll be our homecoming speaker next year. Well, if you want to make a difference, you got to be an instrument for revival in the church. Also, if you want to make a difference, you need to be saying, I will listen to him carefully. I struggle with this sometimes. I don't know about you. I'm a doer. I've told you that a number of times. I'm a doer. I want to do, just let me give it, tell me what needs to be done. Let's go do it and be done with it, and I don't have to worry about it. And I'd been praying. I'd been praying that God was going to do something great in that revival service, and I'd shared with Amy, how I'd been praying. I was sure hoping to God. The church was a lot more troubled than we understood going in, and she began to pray with me about that and talking about it, and we had conversations. And then, if you don't think God knew what He was doing when He gives you a wife and a husband and man come together, and He says He's going to be your helpmate, He's going to be that other part of you. The two become one. Amy says, well, why don't you ask the congregation to get serious about praying for the church and the revival that was coming up? This is prior to this big service that I've just described to you. Now, don't get me wrong. In the months leading and the weeks leading up to the service, I've been telling the congregation, we're going to have this revival coming. We got revival coming, and we want you to be praying for our revival. Don't forget, we got a revival. And you may not know Brother Dennis Crehan. I do. I knew him from school. I was trying to prep him up front who he was and stuff, and just be praying. We ask you to be praying. Pray, pray, pray. Okay, I thought I told him how to pray. And I reminded Amy about that. I knew what I was doing. She must not have been listening to me at the services, because you heard me every week saying I've been telling the people to pray. And she'd say, oh, I hear you. I'm like, you're not listening. And there's a story in 1 Samuel chapter 3 where Samuel was just a young boy. He's been carried back to live with Eli. And as he's living there and helping tend around the worship services in the temple and various things, and whatever he could do, one night he's laying down asleep, and when he hears someone call his name, so he assumes it's Eli, and he gets up and he goes in there because he's heard somebody say, clear as day, Samuel, Samuel. So he gets up and he goes in and says, yes, did you call me? What do you need something? Eli said, what are you doing up this late? Go back and lay down. I didn't call you. I don't need anything. He's probably like me. I wake up sometime, think I've heard something. I get around, so, I must have been dreaming. So he goes, lays back down. And it's not long, he hears the same thing. Samuel, Samuel. He gets back up. He walks back in there where Eli is. He says, did you call me? I heard somebody call my name. Boy, quit sleepwalking. Go back to bed. Just go back to bed. Third time it happens, and finally, when he comes in that third time, Eli says, he's getting a little bit perceptive now. He's like me. It don't take 3 or 4 times. We catch on. And Eli says this. He says, if it happens again, you simply say these words. Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening. And so that's what happened. The 4th time it came, and the Bible says in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, the Lord came and stood there calling as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And then Samuel says, speak, for your servant is listening. And here's what God says. He says, and the Lord said to Samuel, see, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. Now, the Bible tells us in 1 Samuel 3, verse 1, that the word of the Lord had been rare in those times. And obviously, people are waiting for God to do something. They want to hear from him, but he's been quiet. There's no doubt they've been coming and making their sacrifices and doing their offerings and going through their rituals of worship, and yet they were not hearing anything from God. Why? Because they're not listening. Even if God told them to do something, they chose not to do it. So you're not going to listen. I'm going to let you go on about your own way. And God is using someone different to get their attention. Now, don't let this go to her head. But God used Amy as my young Samuel. You know, I'm full of fire. I'm ready to go. I'm fresh out of Bible college. I finally graduated. I'm not now you're going to be a good preacher one day. You keep working at it, fella. I'm the preacher. I've been ordained. I've been sanctified and certified. I've been set apart. She's just my wife. And so, in other words, maybe people are praying, but you're not listening. So Amy, in her lovely voice, says, I know you've been telling the church to pray for revival in the church, but have you thought about a dedicated time of prayer specifically for that? You obviously are not listening to me. I tell them every week to pray for revival in the church. She recommended that she thought God was laying on her heart a 24-hour time of prayer. Just a couple of weeks before our service. And she laid it out. I mean, you know, just plain as day, people praying around the clock at the church building for 24 hours. There would be a sign-up sheet. They could, so there wouldn't be any gaps. Many people wanted to come. Any particular time frame could come. People just pray day and night. Praying, that's it. Asking God to do something big. So I was like, well, yeah. I guess that would work too. You know? So doing like any good preacher I would do, I went fishing. I didn't just go there to the pond or the river or the lake. I went and began to talk to the people. What I have learned, though, is that after 27 years of being married to Amy, now almost, going on this year, she's a person of prayer, an effective prayer, and she listens. And I'd been praying, God, what do you want us to do? My problem was, I wasn't listening carefully. You ever been there? Third thing you need to understand if you're going to make a difference, you need to be willing to follow him obediently. Leviticus 18:4 just reminds us these words, you must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. That told me Daniel's not the Lord. It's not my way, it's his way. I like what you say sometimes, Jimmy, when you're praying. Your will and your time, your way. Like I said, I as much as I wrestle with a 24-hour prayer service and how people are going to get up and come out in the middle of the night and wrestle with all that kind of stuff, and I had made excuses against it, I quickly learned that's what the Lord wanted. As I said, I went fishing. I went and talked to the people. I began sharing my idea about this prayer service. My idea. After all, we two become one, so you get credit for it. You know what I'm saying? You know how that works? And I began talking to people. Maybe I'd say something like, you know, I'm thinking about this revival. I've been asking people to pray. I'm thinking about having a prayer service dedicated just for this service to come along. I don't know how long it'll be, maybe 6, maybe even 12 hours. And some of the people I was talking with said, that's a good idea. You got some good ideas. I'm glad we hired us a young preacher with good ideas. yeah. They said, but have you thought about making it 24 hours? I was like, well, yeah, that might work too. And as I began to go back home and walk around our property and our church and facility and asking God what he wanted to do with it, I went home. I told Amy, I had decided that we're going to move forward with a 24-hour prayer service. And she simply said, I'm glad. I think you're doing what God wants. That was a powerful time. I mean, people unified for a common purpose and goal and just seeking God's will to heal and restore his church. Isn't that what we need? I mean, as a result, the revival, the likes people have told me they hadn't seen in 40 years took place in that little church. And let me ask you, do you want to see the same thing take place here? Do you want to see it take place in Roanoke Rapids? I mean, you consider the statistics I gave you earlier. There's a strong possibility that people could completely walk away from God in a generation. Josh McDowell, in his book, The Last Christian Generation, says we're only one generation away from the church dying anyway. All it's going to take is for Satan to get into the hearts of one generation, and the church is doomed. What about you? I have a proposition for you. Will you join me for a 24-hour time of prayer here at the church building on March 17th and 18th? There's more information in your program about it. We'll begin at 9 a.m. in the morning. That gives people, those who say, well, I can't get out in the middle of the night and do things, or those who have a more difficult time getting around, they can get out during the day. But then I want to ask those of you who could get out in the middle of the night to make sure that you're putting your name on the list to sign up and come out and just be praying about the strength of God's church and the community in which we live and how God's going to use each and every one of us. You know, we've been meeting with some individuals within the church. Each month we try to take a small group of individuals and sit down and eat dinner with them and just get their input. And what we got last month was we just need to make sure we're unified in the things that we do so we can pray for unity in the church. And then make sure that we're all on the same page. And then next time we got together this past week and we find out that people are challenged with service and growth. And they want to use evangelism to make sure that we get that done. So our service moves us into the area of evangelism. Growth, what? Wins people to Christ as a result of our evangelism. So we need to say, God, how do you want to use us? And how will you use me? I want to make a difference. Now, I understand we're asking you to put an hour of your day aside for specifically praying for the New Testament Christian church. And that God's will is going to be done. The challenge is, I think you're going to be hard-pressed if you sign up to just be here for an hour. Let me tell you about Jim. There's nothing more humbling as a preacher than you come in and you see an 80-something-year-old man like this. He thinks he's in the building by himself. And he's like this. But he's praying out loud. Lord, this is the place where your word goes forward. God, I'm old and I'm getting weaker. There's only so much I can do. But you empower our preacher to use your word to change lives. We're going to have to trust you for that, God. Many of us have done what we feel like we can do. But there's so much promise still for your church. We pray you open our hearts and the people around us to help find Jesus. And use Daniel in whatever way you see fit. I have to tell you, I'm walking in the door. He doesn't hear the door come in. And I'm hearing this man pray for me, and I begin to cry. Now, you notice I don't cry a whole lot. And sometimes I get emotional. I'm trying to refrain from doing that, even as I recapture what Jim was doing. And then our choir loft was over there, but just say he went to where the choir would sing or whoever was going to help sing, and he begins to pray for those people. And he just says, God, let the music that goes out of this place and the words that go out, let them sweep over the people's hearts. Just let them, God, you know what we need, and let us, the songs, whatever they are, just to sweep our hearts so that we draw closer to you in worship. And then he moves, and he goes back, and then we find him over the baptistry. And his prayer was this: God, as the waters stirred in the pool of Siloam and brought healing, may these waters of the baptism, will they sweep over our hearts? Let them be changed. Let us find healing that only Jesus can bring. Let eternity be in people's hearts. I hadn't prayed that prayer. I pray that I tell people about Jesus, that people accept Christ. And I found myself saying, maybe the reason people ain't accepting Jesus is I've not been praying that prayer. So I began to pray it. And starting with our revival, moving over the next 2 or 3 months, we had 14 baptisms. Now you got to understand, our baptistry wasn't as nice as this one. The heater didn't work for one thing, and it was one of the big pools. You had to get in and fill it up with cold water. You really wanted to have Jesus if you were going to get baptized in that church. But in just about 3 months' time, a rural church, a couple of miles outside of town, 14 new believers baptized into Christ. Now, I'm going to tell you something. An elder got baptized. He recommitted his life. An 86-year-old man who had served on our leadership team over at some point in time in the history of the church. He was a thorn in my side from the jump street, as my friend used to say, from the day I walked into that I won't say prison, that church. And one Sunday, I'd preached a message, and I knew it was going to be different. And he called me. I knew normally on Sundays, we couldn't sit there and eat. We're going to get a phone call if I said something that didn't quite rub right with that particular couple. And it was his wife, sweet little old elderly lady. She lived forever. She was faithful. She didn't miss a time for the door to be open. He was blind as a bat. She didn't have no license, so she looked and he drove. Now, literally, they lived at the end of the road. She told him which way to go, left, right. He might have just been laying down in the seat, turning the wheel. He couldn't see. He wore these big, thick glasses. He had this macular degeneration. He could just see a little bit around the outside, the way his vision was. He could not see. And I got a call after church that day. We were eating lunch, a sandwich or something like that. And she said, Daniel, I knew who it was. You heard that, Daniel, enough. Horace wants to know if you can come up here and talk to him. He wants to talk to you about that message you preached today. He needs to talk to you today. He don't want to wait. I said, yes, ma'am, let me finish my sandwich. I'll be right down there. I went in there ready. And what I knew was that he was set back in his chair with his throw across his legs. And it's summertime. It's hot. It is hot. And they don't have no air conditioning in their house. He's wrapped up in a blanket. there's a window in the storm door that's cracked about this high. The one on the other side, on the opposite side of the room to get a draft across there, it's open about that much. And they said this, I'm already sitting there with water running down inside my face. I don't know if it's frustration, nervousness, or just pure heat. And to break the ice in the conversation, they said, now, if you're too cool, that draft's too cool, we can close the window. It was 90-some degrees outside. Never had no air conditioning. That's the reason it was always so cold in the church. I'm waiting. I said, no, I'm fine. What you got on your mind? He said, well, Daniel, I've been thinking about that message that you preached today. Your message title was, Who Are You? And you begin to talk about how people followed God and didn't follow God. And some people wanted to be like Pharaoh and said, who's God that I should obey him? And I want to tell you something today. That message is the best message you preached since you've been here. He said, and as you described those individuals from that passage of Scripture, I found out that I was being Pharaoh too long. And what I'm asking you to do was you do me the honor to baptize me again into Christ. Erase everything I was going to say before I come up there. And I said it'd be an honor. And that evening, we had to fill the baptistry up, had a hole in it. There's more sin under that church than you could ever count. Because you just fill it up and it start running out the bottom. We filled it up that afternoon. Took 2 other men besides myself to get him in there because he was in such frail condition. And there, he says, before I get baptized, I want to say a few things. I'm like, I thought we... And he stood up and he confessed that he had not been the man that God wanted him to be. He had helped preside around the Lord's table with whiskey on his breath. He had spoke when he shouldn't have spoke and not spoken when he should have spoke for the Lord. And he wanted to get his life right. He said, but I'm not the only one. Who's going to join me? I've asked this man right here to baptize me tonight. I think we had one other person that made a rededication, no baptism. 86 years old. Within a matter of 3 months, God calls him home. He was sick in the hospital. He wanted to go home. I want to go home. I want to go home. They finally let him out to go home. He literally got the door open on the van, and God was merciful to him and took him home. He put his foot on the ground in his yard, and there he collapsed and went home. Now, why did I tell you that story? It all stemmed from the decision that we were going to gather as a body of believers and begin to pray for the renewal of the church and what God would do. What do you want God to do in your church? What do you expect God to do in your life? What changes do you need to make to be in preparation for what God has for you in the future? There's some horses in the room. There's some Daniels in the room. I hope more of you are like this one right here. You're going to be praying people who are listening. But until God takes us away from here, He's got a lot of good work for us to do. And all He's asking us to do is to make a difference.